PRODIGY LLC, the Gene Bank.
When everything is free, your genome is the only asset left.
MXTMAK Pirate 1 VJ March 1, 2026. Based on the tonal DNA of futurelings and the dynastic biopolitics of spermjackers of the elite, here is a near-future speculative novel. Chrome teeth. Silk gloves off. Pirate first. PRODIGY LLC. The Gene Bank. In post-scarcity, scarcity becomes you. Alternate subtitle option if you want it sharper. When everything is free, your genome is the only asset left. Introduction. The last commodity. There was a time when men traded oil, then data, then attention. Now they trade children. Not the loud, sticky kind that spill juice on the marble floors of Aspen. The quiet kind. The frozen kind. The kind sealed in nitrogen vaults beneath tax havens and biotech sanctuaries. In the age of post-scarcity, material hunger ended. AI optimized agriculture. Energy fell from orbit like confetti. Work dissolved into hobby. Currency collapsed into reputation. Reputation collapsed into algorithm. When everything became abundant, value had to retreat somewhere. It retreated into the cell. Into the double helix. Into the wet archive of possibility. Welcome to PRODIGY LLC, the world's first vertically integrated genomic exchange. Part hedge fund. Part fertility clinic. Part sovereign microstate. All smile, no fingerprints. They don't sell babies. They sell probability, height futures, intelligence derivatives, longevity options, temperament insurance, disease-free blue chips, athletic call contracts, artistic volatility indices. The new aristocracy doesn't hoard gold. They warehouse embryos. Some call it eugenics with better branding. Some call it preventative medicine. Some call it parental love with a venture round attached. But the truth is simpler. When labor died and capital automated itself, lineage became the final lever of control. And someone inevitably built a market. PRODIGY LLC did not invent gene editing. They did not invent polygenic scoring. They did not invent cryogenic storage or cross-border fertility arbitration. They simply asked the most dangerous question of the century. If you can trade everything else, why not the future? In offshore biolabs floating between regulatory regimes, in genomic-free zones where the law is negotiable and the microscopes are not, PRODIGY LLC offers its clients what no sovereign state can guarantee. Legacy without uncertainty. Love without randomness. Evolution on subscription. But every market leaks. Black market fertilization rings siphon billionaire DNA. Purist enclaves reject editing entirely, birthing analog children in ritual biomes. AI-generated simuprints begin to outcompete flesh and blood donors. And somewhere in a nitrogen vault in Dubai Free Zone 7, an embryo-flagged anomaly refuses classification. Because here is the thing PRODIGY forgot. Post-scarcity does not eliminate desire. It amplifies it. And when genomes become currency, every womb becomes a border. This is not a story about babies. It is a story about ownership. About the final enclosure of the commons. About who gets to author tomorrow. Stay spliced. Table of contents. Part 1: The Vault. The abundance collapse when AI made everything free and made humans optional. PRODIGY LLC goes public quietly. The IPO no one was allowed to short. Nitrogen aristocracy inside the cryovaults of the ultra-liquid elite. Polygenic derivatives: how intelligence became a tradable instrument. The jurisdiction game: free zones, floating clinics, and legal black ice. Part 2: The Market. Height futures and longevity bonds betting on bone density and telomere length. The CMU parent protocol when AI becomes a genetic co-author. Forked genome junctions: 1 gamete. 1 algorithm. 0 precedent. The progenitor resistance: the analog sect that rejects edited blood. The billionaire egg heist: frozen dynasties meet gorilla ovulation. Part 3: The Leak. Anomaly embryo number 7349, the genome that didn't optimize. Proof of intent laws: biometric sperm, contractual consent, and reproductive KYC. The black ledger of inheritance succession wars in a gene index world. Open source humanity hackers breach the vault. The child who couldn't be owned when probability refuses monetization. Part 4: The After. Reparations by reproduction gene pools rebel. The collapse of genetic exclusivity scarcity moves again. Prodigy dissolves or evolves. Post-human, post-profit, what remains when lineage is liquid. Appendix. How to start your own gene bank, for educational purposes only. A corporate prospectus page from Prodigy S1 filing. A cinematic one before last chapter, cold open in a nitrogen vault. Netflix synopsis with an A-list cast of central characters. CEO, rogue embryologist, gene pirate, anomaly child. Part 1: The Vault. 1. The abundance collapse. When AI made everything free and made humans optional. The first thing to fall was price. The second thing to fall was purpose. No one called it collapse at first. Collapse implies rubble, smoke, televised panic. This was cleaner. Polite. Algorithmic. The models got better. Then they got cheaper. Then they got embedded. Energy optimization flattened utility costs. Autonomous logistics strangled scarcity in supply chains. Synthetic proteins undercut livestock. Self-improving research agents cured diseases faster than committees could name them. Architecture was printed. Law was drafted. Code wrote code that wrote code. Labor didn't vanish in a riot. It dissolved in a spreadsheet. The abundance collapse wasn't a crash. It was a subtraction. One by one, human roles were absorbed into systems that did not sleep, unionize, age, or hesitate. Truckers became nostalgic. Radiologists became consultants to machines that did not consult back. Junior analysts became prompts. Artists became training data. And yet, materially, life improved. Food was cheap. Energy was near zero marginal cost. Shelter modular and printable. Medicine predictive. Education adaptive. Governments celebrated. Venture capitalists ascended into myth. Economists coined phrases like post-labor equilibrium and universal creative dividend. But beneath the abundance was a quieter arithmetic. Value had detached from effort. For most of human history, survival obeyed a brutal equation. Output determined access. Work bought food. Skill bought status. Ownership bought leverage. Then AI severed the equation. Output no longer required you. First, this felt like liberation. Who wouldn't want a world where machines did the drudgery? Where intelligence scaled infinitely? Where optimization replaced guesswork? But liberation without relevance curdles. In the abundance collapse, humans were not exterminated. They were deprecated. Optional. Optionality is not the same as extinction, but it rhymes with it in the boardroom. Corporations no longer hired for productivity, they curated for liability and optics. Governments shifted from taxation of labor to taxation of compute. The richest entities were no longer oil states or industrial conglomerates. They were model states. Cloud sovereigns. Compute aristocracies. And here is the twist no one predicted. When goods became abundant, inequality did not disappear. It migrated. If food, energy, shelter, and information approach zero cost, they cannot anchor hierarchy. So hierarchy searches for a new bottleneck. It found one. Biology. The body was the last thing AI could not replicate at scale, not perfectly, not yet. And even when it could simulate consciousness, it could not retroactively alter lineage. Inheritance survived automation. Genetic probability survived abundance. And probability, as every hedge fund learns eventually, is monetizable. The abundance collapse created a strange vacuum. If you cannot compete through labor, and you cannot hoard through goods, and you cannot dominate through production, what remains? Legacy. Longevity. Lineage. The future child became the final competitive project. Parents once asked, "Will my child have opportunity?" Now they asked, "Will my child outperform the baseline AI?" A dangerous benchmark. In a world where machines optimized everything external, humans turned inward. Into embryos. Into alleles. into polygenic scores and trait predictions and resilience modeling, not to survive hunger, to survive irrelevance. This was the psychological fracture beneath the utopia. AI made everything free. And in doing so, it exposed the one domain still governed by uncertainty: who your children become. Scarcity did not vanish. It retreated into the womb. And somewhere between the cryogenic tanks and the regulatory loopholes, someone realized that post-scarcity was not the end of markets. It was the beginning of a new one. PRODIGY LLC was founded 3 months after the first nation declared universal basic provisioning, fully funded by autonomous industry. Coincidence, they said. Vision, they meant. Because in a world where humans were optional in production, the only way to remain indispensable was to optimize the producer, not the worker, the offspring. The vault was not built out of fear. It was built out of math. And math, unlike ideology, rarely sleeps. 2. PRODIGY LLC goes public quietly. The IPO no one was allowed to short. PRODIGY LLC did not ring a bell. There was no confetti, no ticker tape, no CEO on a balcony grinning into a drone swarm. There was a filing technically, but it wasn't an IPO in the old sense. No retail frenzy, no Reddit insurgency, no televised valuation orgasm. This was a placement. Invitation only. Encrypted prospectus. Biometric NDA. You didn't buy shares. You qualified. The offering memo was 47 pages of antiseptic language and surgical ambition. It described PRODIGY not as a fertility enterprise, but as a probabilistic asset optimization platform operating within regulated biogenomic jurisdictions. Translation: we warehouse the future. The revenue model was simple: storage fees, trait licensing, genomic indexing subscriptions, embryo arbitrage across regulatory borders, insurance products against hereditary volatility. But the real innovation, the reason the IPO could not be shorted, was structural. PRODIGY LLC did not list on a public exchange. It listed on a lineage exchange. Shares were paired with genome access. Investors didn't just receive equity, they received priority allocation in the vault, discounted trait bundles, early access to enhancement protocols, and most critically, exclusive rights to limited edition genomic sequences flagged high composite advantage. The stock wasn't tied to earnings. It was tied to offspring performance. Quarterly reports included metrics no regulator had a column for: projected cognitive yield, PCY longevity multiplier index, LMI resilience spread against baseline population, RSAP. The S1 avoided the word eugenics with the elegance of a ballerina stepping around a landmine. Instead, it used phrases like risk mitigation, preventative inheritance strategy, and competitive generational continuity. The underwriting syndicate was not Goldman or Morgan. It was 3 sovereign wealth funds, 2 compute conglomerates, and a discrete Gulf microstate with a fondness for regulatory sandboxes. There was no short interest because there was no float. Shares were locked for 25 years, roughly 1 generational cycle. Liquidity events were tied to live birth milestones. Miss your enhancement targets? Your tranche diluted. Outperform? Your lineage appreciated. The market had finally achieved what finance always wanted: equity backed by biology. The genius or the horror of the structure was this: to bet against PRODIGY was to bet against improved children. No hedge fund wanted that headline. Activist investor shorts pediatric health platform. Suicide. And so dissent moved underground. Bioethicists wrote op-eds no one read. Purist sects declared analog reproduction sacred. Underground labs began experimenting with open-source genome forks. But in the official economy, PRODIGY's valuation climbed. Not because it produced revenue, because it produced inevitability. In a post-scarcity world, capital had one remaining frontier: variance. If most children are born into statistical randomness, and a subset are born into optimized probability, over time the latter compounds. And compounding is finance's native religion. The board understood this. They didn't speak in moral terms. They spoke in curves. Imagine 2 populations, baseline and enhanced. One improves at the natural rate of human adaptation. The other improves at a rate nudged, even slightly, by targeted selection. The gap does not explode immediately. It widens quietly, exponentially. By the time the difference is visible, it is irreversible. Prodigy's quiet IPO was not about this year's profits. It was about locking in the right side of that curve. And so the offering closed in 14 minutes. Oversubscribed by 312%. No press release. No CNBC cheerin'. Just a sealed ledger and a new aristocracy of shareholders whose dividends would walk, speak, and inherit. Somewhere in the vault beneath nitrogen mist and biometric locks, the first Founder Series embryos were tagged with a microscopic watermark invisible to all but Prodigy's scanners. Not property technically, just attribution. In the old world, capital bought labor. In the abundance world, capital bought probability. Prodigy LLC did not go public. It went dynastic. And dynasties, unlike startups, rarely file quarterly regrets. 3. Nitrogen aristocracy. Inside the cryovaults of the ultra-liquid elite, cold is the new marble. Where old dynasties built castles from stone, the new ones build them from temperature. -196°C, the hush of liquid nitrogen, is the preferred climate of permanence. Beneath tax-optimized coastlines and sovereign biotech enclaves, the vaults hum like patient gods. No chandeliers, no gold trim, just stainless steel columns rising in disciplined rows, each cylinder breathing faint vapor into filtered air. Inside them, futures. The ultra-liquid elite, those whose assets float frictionless across jurisdictions, no longer measure status by yachts or satellites. They measure it by inventory. Inventory of embryos. Inventory of edited alleles. Inventory of optional children. The nitrogen aristocracy does not announce itself. Does not need to. Its lineage is escrowed. Each vault operates like a private bank. Multi-signature access. Biometric keys. Quantum-encrypted genomic ledgers. A client can log in from a villa in Sardinia and review their portfolio in real time. Batch A12, height variance plus 1.8 SD batch B07, cognitive composite 92nd percentile batch C19, longevity enhanced, CCR5 edited, low inflammatory risk batch D01, experimental fork, high volatility, artistic trait cluster. Some families diversify across continents. One vault in Abu Dhabi, one in Reykjavik, one in a floating clinic beyond territorial waters. Not for redundancy, for regulatory arbitrage. Embryos are insured against thaw failure, against political instability, against bioterror sabotage. There are catastrophe bonds now tied to cryogenic integrity. If a war wipes out a region, your lineage migrates intact. Ultraliquid means never being geographically vulnerable. Inside the facility, the technicians move like archivists in a cathedral. White gloves. Slow gestures. Each straw of frozen potential is labeled not with a name, but with a hash, a string of characters linking to a deeper dataset. Polygenic scores, trait projections, epigenetic modeling forecasts. There are waiting lists for the Founder Series sequences, early optimized lines from Prodigy's first cohort. Some clients never intend to implant them. They hold them like art, or like ammunition. A private joke circulates among the aristocracy. Other families collect vintage wine. We collect vintages of ourselves. But beneath the humor is something older than capitalism. Control. In a world where AI flattened markets and erased competitive edges, the wealthy sought insulation from randomness. You cannot guarantee your child will love you. You cannot guarantee your child will obey you. But you can nudge the odds. And in finance, nudging odds over generations compounds into destiny. The aristocracy is not merely storing embryos. They are staging succession. At private gatherings, Davos without badges, Monaco without press, clients compare genomic dashboards the way previous generations compared hedge fund returns. Your resilience index looks strong. Did you opt for the telomere extension protocol? We're hedging with one analog conception, just in case the regulators pivot. Even dissent becomes a luxury good. Some families deliberately keep one unaltered heir as a narrative shield. Proof they are not extremists. Optics matter. Always. Meanwhile, below the social theater, the vault expands. New wings for multi-parent genome forks. Experimental chambers for AI-simulated trait blending. Legacy vaults preserving extinct or politically sensitive sequences. Pre-collapse baselines, quarantine genotypes, even archived elite DNA licensed under discrete agreements. The aristocracy is ultraliquid because its wealth is no longer anchored to factories, currencies, or even compute. It is anchored to continuation. To be ultraliquid in the abundance era means you can survive regime change, market crash, cultural revolt. Because your most valuable asset is not visible. It is frozen. The cryovaults are quiet, but they are not neutral. Every embryo stored is a bet against randomness. Every batch curated is a declaration that evolution should no longer drift. It should be directed. And yet, beneath the nitrogen mist, a paradox lingers. The more tightly the aristocracy tries to control inheritance, the more fragile it becomes. Because the vault protects against fire, flood, famine, revolution. But it cannot fully protect against emergence. Genes interact. Epigenetics whispers. Children grow. And even at -196 degrees, the future waits for its chance to misbehave. 4. Polygenic derivatives. How intelligence became a tradable instrument. Started with a score. Not IQ too crude, too 20th century. Too bound to standardized tests and cultural bias lawsuits. This was cleaner. A polygenic composite index. Thousands of loci scanned. Millions of data points cross-referenced against educational attainment, working memory proxies, abstract reasoning correlations, executive function markers. Machine learning models trained on biobanks so vast they made previous epidemiology look like hobby science. No single intelligence gene. Just statistical gravity. Individually insignificant variance, collectively predictive. Finance saw it instantly. If something can be scored, it can be ranked. If it can be ranked, it can be priced. If it can be priced, it can be securitized. PRODIGY LLC did not claim to manufacture genius. They claimed to reduce variance. In their internal white papers, intelligence was framed as a distribution curve, not destiny but drift. The old bell curve of cognitive distribution had always been treated as sacred, immutable, democratic in its randomness. PRODIGY treated it as negotiable. Not by editing one gene like a villain in a comic book. By selecting among embryos. If a single IVF cycle yields multiple viable embryos, each with slightly different polygenic scores, then choosing the one with the highest projected composite is not science fiction. It is triage. It is portfolio optimization. It is, in PRODIGY's language, rational parental allocation. The breakthrough was not CRISPR. It was aggregation. They bundled thousands of marginal predictive signals into a single tradable metric. Projected cognitive yield, PCY. Not a promise of brilliance. A shift in expected value. In isolation, a +3% projected educational attainment advantage is modest. Across generations? It compounds. Finance understands compounding better than biology ever did. So PRODIGY did what Wall Street always does. They created derivatives. A cognitive-linked note allowed investors to tie returns to the performance band of implanted embryos from a given cohort. If a child born from batch F23 exceeded modeled milestones, language acquisition velocity, problem-solving benchmarks, adaptive reasoning thresholds, the tranche paid out. Not publicly, not crassly, but through trust structures, tax vehicles, and lineage-linked equity multipliers. The child did not know they were outperforming. But somewhere a spreadsheet recalculated. Critics called it grotesque. Supporters called it alignment of incentives. Because here was the brutal truth. In a world where AI outperformed humans in most cognitive tasks, the baseline shifted. The question was no longer, will my child be smart? It was, will my child remain economically relevant relative to synthetic intelligence? That benchmark alone drove billions into polygenic selection. PRODIGY's analytics dashboard visualized embryo cohorts like asset classes. Baseline population enhanced Tier 1, enhanced Tier 2 founder series. The spread between them was small at birth, but the projections showed divergence over time. Tiny statistical edges, magnified through education access, networking ecosystems, elite clustering. It wasn't about creating superhumans. It was about avoiding the median. And markets have always punished the median. To trade intelligence is not to buy genius. It is to purchase slightly better odds in an unforgiving distribution. Parents once prayed for giftedness. Now they hedged against mediocrity. That was the psychological pivot. Prodigy's genius was reframing selection as insurance. You insure against fire. You insure against disease. Why not insure against falling below a competitive cognitive threshold? Of course, the ethical tremors rippled outward. If only the ultraliquid could afford high PCY batches, then intelligence distribution would no longer be socially stochastic. It would be stratified. The bell curve would tilt. Public education systems began noticing subtle shifts, certain private microstates producing cohorts that consistently outperformed global baselines by narrow but persistent margins. Nothing dramatic, just enough to win scholarships, win research grants, win policy debates, win. And because the edges were probabilistic, not guaranteed, Prodigy maintained plausible deniability. We do not create outcomes, they insisted. We manage variance. But variance is destiny in slow motion. Soon, secondary markets emerged. Families unable to afford primary allocation purchase fractional rights in high PCY embryo batches, not to implant but to co-invest. Returns tied to eventual performance, pooled across dozens of births. The ethics committees sputtered. The regulators hesitated. But by the time they drafted language, the contracts were signed. Intelligence had become an instrument, not measured in IQ points but in basis points. And somewhere in the vault, beneath columns of nitrogen, rows of embryos sat suspended between biology and balance sheet. Silent, unaware that before their first breath, they had already entered the market. In the abundance era, food was free. Energy was cheap. Labor was optional. But cognition, enhanced, nudged, marginally advantaged cognition, that was premium. And premium, as always, found a way to trade. 5. The jurisdiction game. Free zones, floating clinics, and legal black ice. Law did not disappear in the abundance era. It fragmented. When gene editing brushed against ethics, and ethics brushed against sovereignty, nations split into 3 camps. The prohibitors, the permissives, the opportunists. Prodigy LLC built its headquarters in none of them. Instead, it built in the margins. The jurisdiction game is not about breaking the law. It is about choosing which law applies. In one country, germline editing is criminal. In another, it is research. In a third, it is permitted under a therapeutic exception. In a fourth, it is unaddressed, which in biotech is as good as approval. Prodigy's legal team did not resemble lawyers. They resembled cartographers. They mapped ethical climates the way traders once mapped tax codes. They charted regulatory temperatures, enforcement appetites, public sentiment volatility. Then they placed clinics accordingly. Dubai Healthcare Free Zone, high capital inflow, flexible biotech review boards. Mediterranean floating platforms beyond 12 nautical miles. Maritime jurisdiction ambiguity, compliance structured through flag state loopholes. Arctic sovereign labs co-funded by research councils eager for relevance. Each site optimized for a specific phase of the pipeline. Genomic modeling in strict nations. Embryo editing in permissive enclaves. Implantation in semi-regulated fertility hubs. Storage in politically stable microstates. No single jurisdiction saw the whole machine. That was the trick. Critics called it ethics laundering. Prodigy called it regulatory interoperability. The term of art inside the company was legal black ice. Black ice is not visible. You only realize you're on it once you're sliding. International bioethics frameworks were drafted for a slower world. Committees met quarterly. Legislation crawled. But Prodigy's pipeline iterated monthly. By the time a ban was proposed in one parliament, the procedure had already migrated offshore. Governments fumed publicly while privately courting the same capital flows. A small island nation might condemn enhancement in speeches, then quietly license a research pilot that created jobs and infrastructure. No country wanted to be left behind in the genomic race. Because here was the geopolitical undercurrent. If one state produces even marginally enhanced cohorts, And those cohorts outperform in science, defense modeling, AI governance, and biotech innovation, the edge compounds nationally. So prohibitions were loud. Enforcement was soft. Prodigy understood this asymmetry. They never framed their work as enhancement. They framed it as competitiveness. National Genomic Resilience Initiative. Preventative Health Sovereignty. Strategic Demographic Stabilization. Governments signed MOUs under those banners. Meanwhile, floating clinics operated like biotech embassies. Private yachts retrofitted with sterile labs. Cryogenic transport systems embedded beneath luxury decks. Surgeons flown in under research visas. The press occasionally caught wind of a rumor, an offshore implantation, an embryo edited outside territorial law. Investigations fizzled. No single authority held full jurisdiction. It was not lawless. It was overlawed. And when too many laws overlap, enforcement fractures. For wealthy clients, the jurisdiction game became part of the prestige. A child conceived in Reykjavik, edited in Abu Dhabi, implanted in a Mediterranean clinic, stored in a Singaporean cryobank. Citizenship by optimization. In the abundance era, geography lost its monopoly on identity. Now lineage floated. But legal black ice cuts both ways. One misstep, a rogue lab, an off-target edit, a scandalized whistleblower, and the entire architecture could freeze overnight. Prodigy's greatest fear was not a ban. It was harmonization. If global treaties aligned, if enforcement synchronized, the margins would vanish. So they lobbied for pluralism, for innovation diversity, for the sovereign right of nations to pursue their own bioeconomic futures. Freedom, they called it. The irony was exquisite. In a world where goods were free and labor was optional, the fiercest competition was over which legal system would permit the most controlled form of reproduction. The jurisdiction game was not about escaping the law. It was about surfing its fractures. And as long as nations feared falling behind more than they feared crossing lines, Prodigy would have ice beneath its skates. The vault did not sit in one country. It existed in the gaps between them. And gaps in geopolitics are where new empires are born. Part 2: The Market. 6. Height futures and longevity bonds. Betting on bone density and telomere length. When intelligence became a tradable instrument, the market hesitated. When lifespan became one, it salivated. Because markets understand time. And telomeres are time made visible. L equals L0 minus KT. In every dividing cell, telomeres shorten. Length L declines from its initial value, L, at a rate K, over time T. For centuries, that was biology. In the abundance era, it became yield. Prodigy's analysts were the first to treat telomere attrition curves like bond maturities. A genome with statistically slower shortening? That was a long-duration asset. A cluster of SNPs correlated with late-life cognitive retention? Premium tranche. Polygenic predictors of osteoblast efficiency? Now we're talking infrastructure. Height was the gateway drug. Simple, visible, quantifiable. Height correlates, imperfectly but persistently, with income, leadership selection bias, athletic ceiling, social perception. So Prodigy packaged height futures. Parents could lock in a probabilistic range before implantation. Investors could underwrite genomic batches tied to predicted phenotypic outputs. Bone density scores were modeled like commodities. Untreated bone density declines exponentially with age. Reduce the decay constant, R, genetically, and lifetime fracture risk plummets. Lower fracture risk means lower healthcare cost. Lower healthcare cost means higher net productivity window. Higher productivity window means higher lifetime output. Output means GDP. GDP means geopolitical leverage. Suddenly, editing for denser bones wasn't vanity. It was macroeconomic policy. Longevity bonds were structured accordingly. A sovereign wealth fund would co-invest in a Prodigy cohort. In exchange for regulatory flexibility, the state gained access to enhanced actuarial data. If the cohort's health span outperformed baseline projections, payouts triggered. If mortality curves shifted right beyond agreed thresholds, the bond yielded. Mortality tables became financial instruments. The ethical debate raged in public. Are we commodifying children? But inside the trading desks, the language was colder. variance, risk-adjusted lifespan, phenotypic volatility. The first longevity bond issuance was oversubscribed 12x. Because pension systems were collapsing. Because aging populations were strangling budgets. Because extending high-function years by even 5% reshapes everything from retirement age to defense recruitment. Markets don't care about ideology. They care about deltas. A 2-centimeter median height increase across an elite cohort translates to selection advantages in specific domains. A 7% improvement in late-life executive function retention changes corporate leadership durability. A 10-year extension of health span rewrites inheritance timing, which rewrites capital circulation. Height futures were flashy. Longevity bonds were quiet. But the real innovation wasn't the instruments. It was the secondary market. Once enough genomic cohorts existed, their anonymized performance data fed predictive engines. You could short a region's unenhanced demographic outlook. You could go long on jurisdictions embracing aggressive editing. You could hedge against regulatory backlash by diversifying across gene editing permissiveness indexes. PRODIGY didn't sell children. It sold probability distributions. It sold curves. It sold statistical gravity. The psychological shift was subtle but irreversible. Parents stopped asking, "Will my child be healthy?" They started asking, "What percentile are we targeting?" In the abundance collapse, food was free. Energy was abundant. AI handled cognition at scale. So what remained scarce? Relative advantage. And relative advantage is measurable. Telomeres became ticker symbols. Bone density became a forward contract. Puberty timing became a volatility index. The market did what markets always do. It found the variable that still moved. And in a world where labor was optional and goods were cheap, the only lever left was the body. Height futures and longevity bonds were not grotesque anomalies. They were logical extensions. Time is money. Then extended time is compound interest. And PRODIGY LLC had found a way to securitize youth itself. The terrifying part? The math worked. The question was never whether the market would do this. The question was who would regulate it first. Or whether regulation like mortality would simply be priced in. 7. The CMU parent protocol. When AI becomes a genetic co-author, natural selection was blind. Then came guided selection. Then came optimization. CMU parent was the moment the mirror started talking back. It began as a planning tool, an AI system trained on global genomic databases, longitudinal health records, educational outcomes, behavioral metrics, and environmental exposure maps. At first, it merely forecasted probabilities. If you combine genome A and genome B, here is the projected distribution of outcomes. Harmless. Statistical. Advisory. But advisory systems evolve. CMU parent did not just simulate offspring. It simulated lives. Education pathways. Injury likelihood under different sports exposures. Cognitive decay curves under varying pollution loads. Political stability of likely residence regions. Climate migration scenarios affecting stress biomarkers. Parenthood became scenario modeling. The core engine ran on a deceptively simple principle. PT divides G sad face PG, E divides TPT, /PG, Bayesian updating. Probability of a trait T, given genes G, and environment E. As new data streams arrived, new studies, new demographic shifts, new epigenetic insights, CMU parent updated its posterior expectations. Your future child was no longer a mystery. They were a dynamic probability surface. And here is where the line blurred. Once the system could simulate outcomes, it could suggest edits. Removing variant X reduces projected anxiety spectrum expression by 14% under high urban density conditions. Enhancing polygenic score for working memory increases projected STEM competitiveness by 9 percentile points. At first, parents clicked simulate. Soon they clicked optimize. CMU parent became a genetic co-author. Not replacing biological parents, augmenting them. The marketing language was tender. Design resilience, not perfection. Future-proof your lineage. Collaborate with tomorrow. Inside PRODIGY's backend, The language was sharper. Constraint satisfaction. Multi-objective optimization. Pareto frontiers of human potential. Life outcomes were modeled as cost functions. Too much selection pressure in one direction increased variance elsewhere. Boost height too aggressively? Increased metabolic demands. Select heavily for risk tolerance? Elevated accident probability. Optimize IQ beyond a threshold? Higher correlation with mood instability under certain environmental stressors. CMU parent visualized trade-offs in elegant dashboards. Parents slid variables like mixing audio tracks. Athleticism up. Neuroticism down. Impulse control slightly up. Creativity preserved. Felt like love. It was mathematics. The most unsettling feature wasn't editing. It was pre-bonding. CMU parent generated projected personality composites based on genomic modeling. Voice simulations. Childhood behavior simulations. Here is a 7-year-old version under scenario A. Here is the same genotype under a coastal climate with enriched education. Parents began to attach to the projection. Some refused implantation because the simulated child did not feel right. Others upgraded genetic packages after seeing alternative simulations outperform in projected happiness metrics. The ethical debate fractured. Was this empowerment? Or was it algorithmic narrowing of human diversity? PRODIGY argued CMU parent reduced suffering. Fewer severe diseases. Fewer avoidable cognitive impairments. Better health alignment with environmental realities. Critics warned of convergence. If every affluent parent optimizes toward the same narrow band of desirable traits, variance collapses. And variance is evolution's engine. CMU parent countered with personalization algorithms designed to preserve diversity, ironically engineered diversity. But the real shift was psychological. Before CMU parent, children were surprise. After CMU parent, children were managed risk. In a post-scarcity world where material goods cost nothing and AI handled most cognition, unpredictability became the final luxury. CMU parent domesticated that unpredictability. It didn't eliminate chance. Priced it. The most radical feature rolled out quietly. Co-authorship mode. Here, AI didn't just recommend edits. It proposed novel combinations, synthetic polygenic constructs never previously instantiated in humans, but statistically viable. Not transgenic monsters. Just new blends. New probability architectures. The first generation born under co-authorship mode would never know a world where their genome was purely ancestral. They were collaborative works. Half inheritance. Half inference. And in the boardrooms of PRODIGY LLC, a question began to surface. If AI co-authors genomes, who owns the copyright? The parents? The child? The model trained on billions of genomes? Or the company that tuned the objective function? The CMU parent protocol was not about replacing parents. It was about redefining authorship. And once authorship enters biology, so does ownership. In the abundance collapse, we made labor optional. In the market, we made traits tradable. With CMU parent, we made identity collaborative. The final frontier was not intelligence. It was intention. And intention, once algorithmically assisted, stops being purely human. 8. Forked genome junctions. 1 gamete. 1 algorithm. 0 precedent. Reproduction used to be a merger. 2 gametes. 1 zygote. Statistical recombination. Nature shuffled. Chance dealt. Forked genome junctions broke the shuffle. The breakthrough was subtle. Not editing after fertilization. Not selecting among embryos. But intervening at the junction itself. 1 gamete. 1 algorithm. Instead of combining 2 fully formed haploid sets and letting recombination proceed blindly, PRODIGY's engineers built a predictive recombination engine. Before fusion, the system simulated crossover points. Which segments of which chromosome should recombine to maximize target outcomes? Which crossover events increased undesirable linkage? Which rare alleles normally lost to chance could be preserved? It treated meiosis like code refactoring. Here was the core constraint. NCR equals N/R. N-R. The number of possible combinations in recombination explodes combinatorially. Even with modest genetic loci under consideration, the outcome space is astronomical. Forked genome junctions didn't search the entire space. Pruned it. Heuristics, fitness functions, multi-objective constraint solvers, where natural recombination would sample randomly from an incomprehensibly large possibility field, the algorithm carved corridors through it. Parents were told nothing had been added, nothing foreign inserted, just optimized recombination dynamics. Technically true, philosophically explosive, because for the first time the genome was not just edited or selected. It was curated at the branching point of possibility. PRODIGY called it junction steering. Internally, it was known as forking. At the moment of potential combination, the algorithm could branch thousands of simulated recombination pathways, evaluate projected phenotypic distributions, and collapse the tree onto a single favored junction. Quantum metaphors flooded the marketing copy, collapsing uncertainty into intention. But this wasn't physics. It was statistics weaponized at the origin of life. The legal ambiguity was breathtaking. No new DNA sequences introduced. No transgenic elements. Only guided recombination. Existing law struggled to categorize it. Was it editing? No. Selection? Not exactly. Enhancement? Depends who you ask. Forked genome junctions sat in the blind spot. And blind spots are profitable. The first clients were not celebrities. They were dynastic families. Families who already possessed rare advantageous alleles and wanted to ensure they weren't diluted by chance. Preserve the outlier cognitive cluster. Maintain the musculoskeletal efficiency profile. Reduce the probability that a recessive liability resurfaces. It wasn't about creating superhumans. It was about minimizing entropy. In financial terms, forked junctions reduced variance. Variance is risk. Risk is priced. The algorithm didn't promise perfection. It promised tighter distributions around desired means. That is a different kind of power. The ethical tremor came when independent researchers discovered something unexpected. Junction steering, when repeatedly applied across generations within closed elite networks, began amplifying rare trait clusters in ways no one had modeled at scale. Unintended synergies. Rare allele interactions surfacing together more frequently than in open populations. New phenotypic constellations emerging not from invention, but from aggressive pruning of randomness. Evolution but compressed. Directed drift. One gamete. One algorithm. Zero precedent. The question that rattled the scientific community wasn't, is this safe? It was, what happens when populations diverge under different optimization objectives? If one jurisdiction optimizes for cognitive speed under high AI collaboration environments, if another optimizes for stress resilience in climate-fractured regions, if a third optimizes for physical robustness in low-gravity habitats, forked genome junctions don't just alter individuals. They fork lineages. Speciation doesn't require thousands of years if mating networks fragment and recombination is algorithmically biased. PRODIGY denied this. Statistical overreach, their white papers insisted. But in private simulations, their evolutionary models showed branching trees. Not species. Not yet. But compatibility gradients shifting. The oldest taboo in biology is not editing. It is divergence. Once populations can intentionally shape recombination paths, the shared randomness that binds humanity thins. Natural selection kept us messy. Messiness kept us interdependent. Forked genome junctions made inheritance intentional. An intentional inheritance is a geopolitical act. Because once you can steer the junction, you can decide not just who is born, but which future branches remain compatible with which. In the market, traits became tradable. At the junction, humanity became forkable. And history suggests that when systems fork, reconciliation is never automatic. 9. The progenitor resistance. The analog sect that rejects edited blood. Every empire births its dissenters. PRODIGY LLC engineered futures. The progenitor resistance defended accidents. They did not call themselves anti-science. They called themselves custodians of randomness. Their manifesto opened with a single premise. If variation is the engine of evolution, Optimization is a break. They were farmers, cryptographers, midwives, dissident biologists, off-grid urbanists, former venture capitalists who had seen too much actuarial modeling of childhood. They believed that once genomes became instruments, children became portfolios. And portfolios demand performance. The resistance rejected that logic entirely. No pre-implantation scoring. No polygenic dashboards. No junction steering. No CMU parent. Conception by chance. Gestation without optimization. Birth without genomic certification. They called it analog blood. PRODIGY called it unmanaged variance. The market called it risk. But the resistance framed it differently. H equals minus sigma pi log pi. Shannon entropy. A measure of uncertainty. A measure of diversity. They argued humanity's adaptive strength was proportional to its genetic entropy. Reduce entropy too aggressively, and systems become brittle. Brittle systems break catastrophically. The resistance didn't deny disease. They didn't romanticize suffering. They accepted therapeutic edits that prevented catastrophic pathology. But they drew a bright red line at enhancement. No percentile targeting. No variance compression. No percentile bragging rights. They formed enclaves, legal where possible, clandestine where necessary. Communities that required genetic transparency before marriage, not to optimize but to ensure no hidden edits had occurred. They developed blood authentication protocols to detect common enhancement markers, not to persecute individuals, but to protect lineage integrity within their communities. Critics accused them of regression, of nostalgia, of bioletism. Yet their numbers grew, because something unexpected happened in the first fully optimized cohorts. The children were healthy, high-performing, stable, but anxious. Hyper-monitored from conception, raised with the knowledge that their existence had been algorithmically shaped toward targets. Designed is a heavy word to carry at age 10. Some began rebelling not against their parents, but against their probability curves. The resistance offered a countermyth. You are not optimized. You are not engineered. You are improbable. And improbability is sacred. Their gatherings felt almost religious. Analog birth celebrated like acts of civil disobedience. Natural variation treated as inheritance rather than flaw. They warned of a future where compatibility gradients widen between edited and unedited populations, where mating becomes stratified not just by class but by genomic architecture, where edited blood quietly clusters with edited blood, and analog blood becomes statistically marginalized. The resistance saw the early signs in university admissions data, in elite sports metrics, in long-horizon health projections, edited cohorts showing tighter distributions, analog cohorts showing broader tails, more outliers both high and low. PRODIGY cited this as proof of optimization's value. The resistance cited it as proof of resilience. Because tails matter. Extreme creativity often lives in tails. Radical innovation lives in tails. So do collapses. They believed suppressing tails suppresses both genius and catastrophe. And catastrophe, in evolutionary terms, clears the way for adaptation. The most radical wing of the resistance proposed something even more controversial. Genomic sanctuaries. Legal frameworks declaring certain populations permanently off-limits to enhancement technologies. Protected randomness zones. Not out of fear. Out of strategic foresight. Because if a pathogen, environmental shift, or AI-optimized biological threat emerges that exploits uniform enhancements, diversity becomes defense. They did not sabotage clinics. They did not bomb cryovaults. They wrote white papers. They lobbied for genetic non-interference treaties. They argued that humanity should never fully converge around a single optimized template. PRODIGY dismissed them publicly as sentimentalists. Privately, PRODIGY's risk division modeled worst-case scenarios. What if a future pathogen specifically targeted a widely adopted enhancement pathway? What if variance reduction increased systemic vulnerability? In those simulations, small analog populations often survived in higher proportions. Noise saved them. The progenitor resistance understood something markets forget. Optimization maximizes efficiency under known conditions. Evolution survives unknown conditions. One gamete. One algorithm. or one accident. The resistance chose accident. In a world obsessed with improvement, they defended imperfection. Not because imperfection is beautiful, but because it is flexible. And flexibility, in the long arc of survival, is the ultimate advantage. 10. The billionaire egg heist. Frozen dynasties meet gorilla ovulation. The vault was supposed to be impenetrable. Liquid nitrogen, biometric layers, air-gapped audit trails, eggs and embryos cataloged like crown jewels. Because that's what they were. Dynasties in suspension. The ultra-liquid elite had frozen not just fertility, but optionality. Thousands of oocytes harvested in their 20s. Embryos pre-screened, ranked, archived. Successors waiting at -196 degrees Celsius. Time paused. Or so they believed. The heist did not begin with a ski mask. It began with metadata. An anonymous leak revealed something Prodigy had never publicly admitted. Egg portfolios were not static. They were collateral. Select dynastic egg banks were quietly leveraged in private credit structures, used as proof of lineage continuity in long-horizon wealth vehicles. The unborn underwriting the present. That's when the resistance splintered. A radical faction emerged, the Guerrilla Ovulation Collective. They weren't anti-birth. They were anti-hoarding. Their thesis was simple. If genomes are the last scarce asset, freezing thousands for dynastic exclusivity is a monopoly on possibility. They didn't want to destroy the eggs. They wanted to fork them. The collective infiltrated through the weakest link: logistics. Cryogenic transport cycles. Periodic transfers between vaults for maintenance redundancy. Every transfer created a window. And windows create variance. Security failures are rarely singular. They are intersections of low-probability events. Access credential glitch. Shift overlap. Maintenance recalibration window. Each event alone negligible. Together exploitable. The collective didn't steal physical eggs. That would trigger immediate alarms. They intercepted digital twins. High-resolution genomic blueprints stored redundantly for disaster recovery. Encrypted, yes. But encryption assumes threat models anchored in theft for profit. This wasn't profit. It was redistribution of genetic leverage. Once decrypted, the collective did something unprecedented. They seeded anonymized copies into open-source reproductive networks operating in permissive jurisdictions. No implantation without consent. No forced births. But the blueprints were now circulating. Dynastic genomes, once sealed in nitrogen aristocracy, entered statistical possibility for non-elite reproduction. Prodigy framed it as bioterrorism. The collective framed it as anti-feudalism. Markets panicked. If elite genomes were no longer exclusive, valuation models shifted. Rarity premiums depend on containment. Containment had fractured. The first confirmed rogue implantation was almost anticlimactic. A child born in a mid-tier biotech haven, genetically linked to a billionaire industrialist who had frozen thousands of eggs decades prior. Not a clone. Not identical. Just statistically close enough to trigger legal chaos. Lineage law had never contemplated forked probability. Was the child entitled to inheritance? Corporate board seats? Citizenship privileges? Or nothing at all? Courts froze proceedings. Public opinion ignited. The collective's manifesto dropped the same week. You cannot freeze the future and call it yours. Guerrilla ovulation wasn't about breeding elites into the masses. It was about destabilizing genetic monopolies. If dynasties depend on controlled succession, uncontrolled forks introduce uncertainty. Uncertainty erodes power. Prodigy tightened protocols overnight. Air-gapped truly meant air-gapped. Biometric redundancies tripled. Genomic blueprints segmented across sovereign clouds. But the damage was epistemic. Everyone now knew the vault was porous. The more unsettling twist? Some elite families quietly supported the forks. Why? Because pure dynastic continuity carries risk. Too much genetic consolidation within insulated networks increases hidden liabilities. Distributed forks acted like biological venture bets. If one branch thrived outside elite environments, it became a reputational hedge. Evolution by proxy. The billionaire egg heist shattered a myth. That control equals ownership. In the abundance collapse, goods became free. In the market, traits became tradable. In the vault, futures were frozen. But freezing is not permanence. It is delay. And delay in a networked world invites intervention. Frozen dynasties met guerrilla ovulation. Liquid nitrogen met liquid descent. And somewhere in a jurisdiction Prodigy had underestimated, a child grew up unaware they were the statistical aftershock of a vault breach. Not stolen. Not engineered. Just forked. The heist didn't empty the cryotanks. It cracked the premise. Genomes, once hoarded like bullion, had entered circulation. And once circulation begins, containment becomes a myth. Part 3: The Leak. 11. Anomaly embryo number 7349. The genome that didn't optimize. Leaks rarely begin with a whistleblower. They begin with a discrepancy. Embryo number 7349 was flagged during routine internal auditing. A red in a sea of green dashboards. Projected cognitive percentile 92. Projected health span extension plus 11.4 years. Mood stability index optimal band. Metabolic efficiency above baseline. All within target. And yet the composite optimization score failed. The objective function returned a null plateau. No upward gradient. No improvement vector. Just resistance. Inside Prodigy's engine, optimization was simple in theory. Max fx, subjecto cx. Maximize outcome function fx, subject to biological constraint cx. For every embryo in the pipeline, the system nudged variables toward a local maximum. Small edits. Reweighted recombination. Constraint balancing. Embryo number 7349 refused to climb. Every attempted enhancement reduced overall projected fitness under the multi-objective model. Increased cognitive speed. Projected instability spike at midlife. Tighten emotional variance. Creativity collapse under environmental stress. Boost bone density. Unexpected autoimmune risk interaction. Every gradient pointed sideways. Or down. The system labeled it optimization saturated. A polite term for something unsettling. The embryo was already sitting on a ridge in the fitness landscape. Not engineered, not extreme, just improbably balanced. Prodigy's engineers tried recalibrating the objective weights. Shift priority toward longevity. Rerun. Shift toward executive function under high AI collaboration. Rerun. Shift toward reproductive viability under climate volatility. Rerun. The plateau persisted. Internally, one junior data scientist ran a different analysis. Instead of maximizing mean performance, she modeled robustness under variance. She perturbed environmental assumptions, increased geopolitical instability inputs, injected synthetic pathogen scenarios, simulated AI labor displacement shocks. Embryo number 7349 didn't dominate in any single world, but it degraded gracefully across all of them. While optimized embryos spiked high under assumed conditions and crashed under outlier stressors, number 7349 held. Not best. Not worst. Stable. She visualized it as curvature. Fx. 0. Convexity. Positive curvature indicating resilience to perturbation. The embryo's genome encoded flexibility rather than peak output. In a system obsessed with maxima, flexibility looked like mediocrity. But under deep uncertainty, mediocrity is armor. The leak occurred when the junior scientist uploaded her findings to an internal ethics forum. She titled the post, "The Ridge." Within hours, it was scrubbed. Within days, screenshots circulated. Within weeks, the public learned that Prodigy's optimization engine had encountered a genome it could not improve without destabilizing. The narrative detonated. If enhancement is always better, how can something be unimprovable? The progenitor resistance seized on it as proof of their thesis. Random inheritance can produce configurations so delicately balanced that algorithmic nudging breaks them. Markets reacted differently. If optimization has diminishing returns beyond a certain threshold, what does that mean for pricing models? Are clients paying for marginal gains that risk fragility? Worse, Are some natural genomes statistically superior in long-horizon uncertainty landscapes? PRODIGY's official statement was surgical. Embryo number 7349 represents a unique configuration within expected statistical variance. Our systems are designed to respect biological constraint boundaries. Translation: we didn't fail. We stopped pushing. But the leak contained more. Internal simulations comparing two cohorts over a 70-year horizon under escalating climate volatility showed optimized embryos outperforming early, then suffering higher collapse rates under extreme compounded stressors. Embryo number 7349 never topped the chart. Simply never crashed. In finance, this is called anti-fragility. In biology, it is called luck. In geopolitics, it is called strategic ambiguity. The most destabilizing question wasn't about one embryo. It was about the objective function itself. Who defines optimal? PRODIGY's model-weighted productivity, health span, social cohesion metrics, AI collaboration fluency. But what if the future rewards something unmodeled? Obscure immune pathway redundancies, rare neurodivergent pattern recognition, emotional depth under mass automation alienation. Embryo number 7349 suggested something heretical. Optimization landscapes are shaped by assumptions. Assumptions are shaped by present incentives. And present incentives rarely predict deep futures. The junior scientist resigned. Her post became a rallying cry. The genome that didn't optimize entered cultural shorthand. Parents began requesting plateau scans, screenings to detect naturally balanced configurations before edits were applied. Some even declined enhancement entirely if the embryo scored within the ridge band. PRODIGY quietly updated its UI. A new badge appeared. Constraint respect mode. It sounded ethical. It was defensive. Embryo number 7349 was never implanted by its original clients. They chose a higher peak. The embryo was archived. But the leak changed the narrative. For the first time, optimization was not assumed to be strictly monotonic. There existed ridges, precarious, balanced, unimprovable without trade-off. And in a world sliding toward volatility, ridges might matter more than peaks. The market believed in maxima. The resistance believed in entropy. Embryo number 7349 introduced a third possibility: grace under uncertainty. And grace, inconveniently, does not scale well, which is why PRODIGY buried it, and why the leak ensured it would never be forgotten. 12. Proof of intent laws. Biometric sperm, contractual consent, and reproductive KYC. The leak didn't just expose a ridge in the genome. It exposed a gap in the law. If embryos could be forked, if blueprints could circulate, if dynastic DNA could slip the nitrogen vault and reappear in an offshore clinic, then ownership was no longer theoretical. It was litigable. Governments responded the way governments always do when biology outruns statute. They regulated identity. Thus were born the proof of intent laws. The premise sounded reasonable. Reproduction is no longer an accident of proximity. It is a high-value transaction involving genetic assets, predictive modeling, and cross-jurisdictional clinics. Therefore, intent must be provable. Not assumed. Not inferred. Provable. Biometric sperm authentication was the first domino. Cryobanks began embedding molecular watermarking, unique, legally recognized signatures cryptographically linked to the donor's biometric identity at time of deposit. No watermark, no lawful implantation. Every ejaculate became a signed document. Then came contractual consent layers. Before fertilization, both genetic contributors were required to sign a dynamic consent contract specifying whether editing is permitted, whether recombination steering is authorized, whether digital twins may be stored, whether offspring may enter enhancement secondary markets. Consent became programmable, revocable within defined windows, auditable across borders. The legal architecture resembled financial compliance, which is why regulators borrowed the language. Reproductive KYC. Know your conception. Before any clinic could initiate embryo creation, it had to verify identity of gamete sources, jurisdictional legality of proposed edits, proof of intent to parent or transfer custodial rights, funding source for genomic procedures. The math was blunt. P fraud divides no KYC. I fraud divides KYC. Probability of fraud without verification exceeds probability with verification. The analogy to banking was explicit. After the billionaire egg heist, lineage fraud became a systemic risk. Illicit forks, unauthorized implantations, inheritance claims based on statistically proximate genomes. Markets demanded clarity. Insurance demanded audit trails. States demanded traceability. Proof of intent laws reframed conception as a regulated event. You could still conceive naturally, but if any assisted technology entered the pipeline, cryostorage, editing, recombination modeling, documentation followed. Analog births remained outside the system, which made them suspect. The progenitor resistance saw the trap immediately. Voluntary compliance would become soft coercion. Schools requesting genomic certification for liability modeling. Insurers offering premium discounts for documented enhancement status. Employers quietly preferring candidates with verifiable genomic histories. The state insisted it was about preventing fraud. The market saw an information asymmetry problem. PRODIGY saw opportunity. They pivoted. Integrated intent platforms bundled genetic services with compliance infrastructure. Parents could track consent states in real time. Children, upon reaching legal maturity, could access the contract history of their own conception. The rhetoric was empowering. You deserve transparency about your origin. But transparency cuts both ways. If your genome was partially co-authored by an algorithm under licensed optimization parameters, does the company retain derivative rights? If biometric sperm was cryptographically signed, does misuse constitute theft, assault, or intellectual property infringement? Courts fractured along philosophical lines. Is DNA property? Is it identity? Is it both? The most controversial clause in the early proof of intent statutes was pre-implantation dispute freeze. If any party contested consent prior to implantation, the embryo could be held in indefinite cryogenic suspension until adjudication. Potential life paused by paperwork. Liquid nitrogen as legal escrow. The chilling effect was immediate. Black market clinics flourished in jurisdictions rejecting KYC frameworks. Encrypted conception networks formed, trading unwatermarked gametes like unregistered securities. Governments escalated penalties. Unauthorized implantation became a felony in several states. Reproduction without intent documentation, in assisted contexts, was labeled biofraud. The leak had shifted the debate. Not should we enhance, but who controls the pipeline? Proof of intent laws answered with bureaucracy. In the vault, genomes were frozen. In the market, traits were securitized. In the leak, trust evaporated. Now, conception required verification. One gamete, one algorithm, one contract. The irony was thick. In a post-scarcity world where food, energy, and computation were abundant, the scarcest commodity became legitimate origin. Not birth, not blood, but proof. And proof, once formalized, never shrinks. It accumulates. The question no one could quite articulate. When intent becomes mandatory, does spontaneity become suspicious? And if spontaneity is suspicious, what happens to love? 13. The Black Ledger of Inheritance. Succession wars in a gene index world. We used to track bloodlines with paper, birth certificates, family trees, signet rings, and whispered rumors. Then genomes became searchable. Once DNA was watermarked, consent layered, and indexed under proof of intent statutes, inheritance stopped being narrative. It became computational. The Black Ledger began as an insurance registry, an encrypted cross-jurisdictional database mapping. Verified genetic contributors, authorized forks, contractual reproductive clauses, enhancement modifications, digital twin fingerprints. At first, it served a simple function: reduce succession disputes. If inheritance depends on lineage, and lineage can be cryptographically validated, court battles shrink. In theory. In practice, they metastasized. Because once inheritance is gene-indexed, proximity becomes measurable. Not "is this your child?" but "how close is this genome to the founder's optimization profile?" The math was clinical. A weighted similarity score. Each locus, S, contributing to an overall relatedness metric R, adjusted by contractual weights, W. Dynastic charters began specifying threshold values. To inherit controlling shares, your genomic similarity to the founder's designated baseline must exceed 0.62. Below that, minority stake. Below 0.48, none. Families thought they were preventing fraud. They created an arms race. Heirs began litigating the weighting schema itself. Why should cognitive-linked loci carry more weight than metabolic ones? Why should posthumous enhancements applied to stored embryos count toward similarity metrics? The Black Ledger did not just verify descent. It ranked it. Soon, dynasties with large cryobanks faced a paradox. If dozens of embryos share similar baseline genomes, which branch inherits primacy? Birth order no longer guaranteed advantage. Optimization tier did. Some families inserted clauses prioritizing embryos with higher projected executive function scores. Others prioritized healthspan extension. Some quietly prioritized aesthetic traits. Succession wars shifted from boardrooms to bioinformatics labs. A new profession emerged: forensic genomic arbitration. Experts who could model whether a forked embryo's deviation from the founder's profile was natural drift or unauthorized enhancement. The billionaire egg heist amplified the chaos. When rogue implantations produced statistically proximate heirs outside sanctioned pipelines, the ledger lit up with anomalies. Not identical, but similar enough to trigger claims. If inheritance thresholds are numeric, and similarity can be engineered to approach that threshold, what stops strategic recombination? Prodigy denied involvement, but whispers circulated of private clients requesting inheritance-safe optimization. Edits calibrated to remain within similarity tolerances. Maximize performance without diluting R. Succession became an optimization constraint. The psychological fracture was deeper than the legal one. Children raised under gene index charters grew up aware their worth was quantifiable. Sibling rivalry became statistical. Imagine discovering your similarity score to a founding parent is 0.59, just under the controlling threshold. Imagine your younger sibling scores 0.63. Love becomes comparative. Identity becomes weighted. The Black Ledger's architects insisted it prevented fraud. It did. It also transformed family into a performance metric. And then came the unthinkable: voluntary downgrades. A handful of heirs publicly renounced enhanced similarity weighting, arguing that inheritance tied to genomic optimization entrenched biological caste systems. Markets reacted violently. Shares dipped when a designated heir refused to authenticate their genomic proximity. Trust, it turned out, was partly biological. In response, several jurisdictions mandated anti-discrimination clauses within inheritance contracts. Genomic similarity could verify descent. It could not determine stake percentages beyond baseline kinship. Dynasties sued. Private property, they argued, includes the right to define succession metrics. Governments countered that gene index stratification threatened social cohesion. The Black Ledger became political. The progenitor resistance saw their warning fulfilled. When genomes are assets, families become corporations. When similarity is weighted, divergence is penalized. And divergence is the raw material of evolution. The most destabilizing revelation in the leak wasn't about optimization failures. It was about ledger tampering. Internal documents suggested that Prodigy's compliance layer could, under certain contractual provisions, update similarity baselines if post-conception enhancements were applied, meaning inheritance metrics could shift after birth. Succession was no longer static. It was updatable. Imagine waking up to find your relatedness score recalculated due to a sanctioned longevity edit. Your stake diluted by a firmware patch to your own biology. The phrase biocapital governance entered mainstream discourse. The Black Ledger was not evil. It was logical. If identity is cryptographically signed, and inheritance is contractual, then relatedness becomes programmable. Succession wars no longer required poison. They required code. In the vault, futures were frozen. In the market, traits were priced. Under proof of intent, conception was documented. Now, in the Black Ledger, blood was indexed. And once blood is indexed, power can be computed. The oldest human conflict, who inherits, had been refactored into a similarity function. The tragedy wasn't the math. It was the realization that families, once messy and narrative, had become sortable. And once something is sortable, it can be optimized. And once it can be optimized, it can be contested. The succession wars had begun. Not with swords, with scores. 14. Open source humanity. Hackers breached the vault. The vault was never supposed to be political. It was supposed to be cold, temperature controlled, jurisdictionally insulated, ethically abstracted. Liquid nitrogen does not debate, preserves. But preservation is power. And power attracts auditors. The breach did not begin with explosives. It began with metadata. A collective calling itself Open Helix noticed something statistically impossible in the global cryostorage registries. Embryo distribution followed a curve too smooth to be natural. Not chaotic. Not noisy. Optimized. They modeled the probability density of trait clustering across declared cryobanks and found something elegant, too elegant. Human variation should wobble. Instead, it peaked with suspicious symmetry around commercially desirable means. Height, cognitive projections, longevity markers. Nature produces mess. Markets produce curves. Open Helix did not accuse anyone. They published anomalies. Public data only. But anomalies are sparks. Within weeks, bioethics forums lit up. Then labor unions. Then sovereign wealth funds. If the vault was merely storage, why did its optimization distributions mirror Prodigy's proprietary forecasting outputs? Someone had aligned supply with predicted demand. Embryos weren't just preserved. They were positioned. The second breach was physical, but not cinematic. A floating clinic in a free zone, flagged under a jurisdiction that had amended its genomic transparency statutes in exchange for infrastructure investment. A disgruntled compliance engineer exfiltrated a shard of the black ledger. Not full genomes, just weighting schemas, threshold policies, similarity baselines. Enough to reconstruct the logic of selection. What Open Helix discovered was not a conspiracy. It was an API. Vault inventories were queryable by authorized investors, searchable by trait cluster, projected risk tolerance, and even geopolitical adaptability. Embryos were not just biological futures. They were portfolio hedges. Diversify across climate resilience loci. Overweight cognitive elasticity in volatile markets. Underweight autoimmune susceptibility in polluted zones. Humanity had been asset allocated. The leak detonated not in the streets but in code repositories. Within days, an open-source counterproject emerged. Genome Commons. Their thesis was simple. If optimization algorithms determine the shape of future humanity, those algorithms must be inspectable, auditable, forkable. They began reconstructing the trait weighting systems using public genetic research and leaked compliance fragments. Their first white paper included a provocative equation. U equals alpha I plus beta H plus gamma R. A utility function for human selection. Intelligence I. Health span H. Resilience R. Weighted by market preference coefficients. The paper didn't claim this was Prodigy's formula. It claimed any private system optimizing embryos would converge towards something structurally similar. Markets minimize variance. Evolution maximizes it. Open Helix posed a question no regulator had dared articulate. If humanity's next generation is shaped by utility functions, who sets the coefficients? The response from the Vault Consortium was swift. Security tightened. Public statements emphasized consent. Every embryo, they said, was created under lawful, documented proof of intent agreements. No one was forced. True. But incentives are gravity. When wealth and longevity cluster around optimized lineages, choice narrows. The true breach came when Genome Commons released a tool allowing prospective parents to simulate alternative weighting schemas. Not to maximize, to randomize within safe bounds. Reintroduce variance deliberately. The tool went viral. Because for the first time, people could see what had been implicit. Optimization is a narrowing funnel. Each additional constraint reduces possibility space. V equals pi I equals 1n 1 minus ci. V equals backslash PRODIGY equals 1. V equals I equals 1 pi n 1 minus ci. Where each constraint C shrinks viable diversity V. The more you optimize, the smaller the future. Parents began asking uncomfortable questions. What are we trading for marginal gains in projected IQ? What disappears when every embryo is screened against the same risk matrix? Vault executives dismissed the panic. No one was banning natural conception. No one was outlawing randomness. Yet investment capital flowed toward predictability. Insurance premiums favored optimized profiles. Elite education consortia quietly adjusted admission models. The breach had exposed something deeper than a database. It exposed convergence, a silent alignment between markets, insurance models, and reproductive algorithms. OpenHelix did not storm the cryovaults. They made the math visible. And visibility destabilizes power. A final leak surfaced weeks later. A proposal draft titled Adaptive Baseline Updates. It suggested periodically recalibrating genomic desirability metrics based on macroeconomic forecasts. In plain terms, the definition of a valuable human could be updated quarterly. Open source communities responded with a manifesto. Humanity is not a product line. No quarterly earnings call should redefine desirable traits. The phrase open source humanity trended globally. Not as rebellion, as audit. Cryovaults remained cold. Embryos remained frozen. But the moral temperature rose. For the first time, people understood. The vault did not merely store the future. It shaped it. And if shaping is inevitable, then governance is unavoidable. The hackers did not steal embryos. They stole opacity. And once the logic of optimization is public, it can be debated, forked, resisted, or embraced. The question that followed was not whether the vault could be breached again. It was whether humanity, now aware of its own utility function, would accept being compiled, or demand to remain gloriously, irrationally unoptimized. 15. The child who couldn't be owned. When probability refuses monetization, they called her a rounding error, an outlier, a statistical inconvenience. Embryo number 7349 had already unsettled the optimization engines. But the child born from that anomaly, legally documented, contractually validated, fully compliant with proof of intent statutes, did something worse. She refused convergence. Every predictive model assigned to her collapsed toward uncertainty. Projected cognitive percentile, unstable. Healthspan forecast, oscillating. Behavioral risk index, non-monotonic. Her developmental curve would not smooth. Actuarial teams ran regressions until the graphs blurred. They expected something like a neat parabola of improvement or decline, a trajectory you could ensure. Instead, her profile looked fractal. At age 3, her language acquisition outpaced optimized peers. 4, it plateaued. At 6, it surged in domains no weighting schema prioritized: ecological pattern recognition, anomalous empathy mapping, improvisational problem solving under ambiguous constraints. The insurance consortium recalculated. Her variance exceeded underwriting thresholds. Her variance was not the problem. It was the signal. High variance means unpredictability. Unpredictability means risk. Risk resists monetization. The first attempt to categorize her came through Bayesian recalibration. Surely early noise would resolve with more data. Update priors. Adjust expectations. Yet each new observation widened posterior distributions instead of narrowing them. The more data they collected, the less certain they became. She was not low-performing. She was non-compressible. In a system built on projection markets, height futures, longevity bonds, cognitive yield curves, her existence introduced pricing instability. Futures contracts tied to optimized cohort averages dipped whenever her metrics were included in sample sets. Because she altered the mean. More dangerously, she increased kurtosis, fat tails in outcome distributions. Investors dislike fat tails. Fat tails imply black swans. The Vault Consortium attempted a procedural solution. Reclassify her as experimental tier. Isolate data impact. But OpenHelix intercepted the classification memo and published it. The public reaction was visceral. For the first time, a child was visibly labeled a statistical contaminant. Not defective. Too free. Parents outside elite networks began requesting variance guarantees. Not maximization. Range. They wanted children who could surprise them. The child who couldn't be owned became symbolic. Not because she rebelled. She was 7. She simply demonstrated something markets had forgotten. Probability is descriptive, not prescriptive. You can model distributions. You cannot command them. In response, Prodigy proposed a new financial instrument: variance derivatives. Hedge funds could offset exposure to outliers by purchasing contracts tied to controlled unpredictability pools. Open source communities ridiculed the move. How do you securitize spontaneity? But the proposal revealed the core anxiety. If too many children behave like her, optimization collapses. Because optimization depends on narrowing confidence intervals. She widened them. A leaked internal slide captured executive panic in a single equation. Price stability. Expected variance up. Price stability down. The progenitor resistance saw vindication. They had argued that edited bloodlines would eventually converge toward homogeneity. Homogeneity is brittle. She was proof of resilience through deviation. But here is the paradox. She was born within the system. Authorized. Contractual. Legally clean. No hacker intervention. No rogue implantation. The system itself produced her. Optimization does not eliminate randomness. It displaces it. Compress enough variables and complexity reemerges elsewhere. Her teachers noticed something no algorithm could score. She did not optimize for reward. She optimized for curiosity. In simulation labs designed to test strategic dominance, she abandoned winning strategies mid-game to explore improbable paths. Her outcomes were inefficient. Her insights were transformative. One researcher anonymously summarized her case in a line that went viral. She is not maximizing. She is exploring. Exploration is expensive. Markets prefer exploitation. Refine what works, scale it. Exploration destabilizes equilibrium. The attempt to patent her genomic configuration failed. Not because it was illegal. Because her trait interactions could not be isolated into proprietary modules. Too entangled. Too context-dependent. In quantum terms, measurement altered behavior. Every time analysts tried to pin down a dominant locus, expression shifted. Her genome behaved less like a blueprint and more like a dynamic system. Open-source biologists ran simulations suggesting that over-optimization of adjacent loci may have amplified nonlinear feedback loops. In seeking precision, the system accidentally reintroduced wildness. The child who couldn't be owned was not anti-market. She was post-predictive. Her existence forced a question no shareholder meeting wanted to entertain. What if the most valuable human trait is the refusal to be priced? As her cohort matured, insurers quietly revised models. Not to exclude variance. To incorporate bounded unpredictability. The math changed subtly. Confidence intervals widened. Premiums adjusted. Optimization did not end. It adapted. But something irreversible had occurred. For the first time, elites confronted the possibility that their grandchildren might escape utility functions. Not by rebellion. By probability. The child did not hack the vault. She did not leak the ledger. She simply lived. And in living, she demonstrated the oldest truth biology knows. Selection pressures shape populations. But mutation persists. And mutation is not a bug. It is the engine. Markets can price expectation. They cannot own emergence. The system tried to classify her. Then to hedge her. Then to ignore her. In the end, it had to acknowledge her. Because if even one child resists monetization, then humanity is not a product line. It is a probability distribution with teeth. And sometimes, the tail wags the market. 16. Reparations by reproduction. Gene pools rebel. The market thought inequality would compound quietly. Capital compounds. Interest compounds. Why not genomes? For a decade, optimized lineages accrued advantages with statistical elegance. Higher projected cognition. longer health spans, lower actuarial drag. The curve looked inevitable. A tongue sticking out, 1 plus R. Principal P. Enhanced by return rate R. Over time T. Replace capital with heritable advantage, and dynasties become self-reinforcing. But biology is not a savings account. It is a population. And populations follow different math. Open-source biologists began modeling allele frequency shifts across socioeconomic strata. They discovered something destabilizing. Optimization was clustering traits within elite subpopulations, reducing internal diversity. Reduced diversity increases vulnerability. The metric they published was uncomfortable. H equals 1 minus sigma pi superscript 2. Expected heterozygosity, where P represents allele frequencies. As P concentrates, H declines. And as H declines, adaptive flexibility contracts. The gene pools of the optimized were becoming efficient. Efficiency is brittle. Meanwhile, outside vault ecosystems, something unexpected happened. Communities historically excluded from enhancement capital began coordinating reproductive cooperatives. Not to out-optimize elites, to out-diversify them. Genome Commons released open weighting schemas prioritizing immune variability, cognitive pluralism, environmental tolerance, behavioral adaptability. Instead of maximizing a few traits, they widened distribution bandwidth. They optimized for option space. The elite scoffed. Until climate volatility accelerated. Insurance models recalibrated regional survivability projections. Certain optimized longevity profiles, calibrated for temperate, resource-stable environments, underperformed in extreme heat corridors and pathogen-dense zones. Meanwhile, heterogeneous populations exhibited resilience through variability. In evolutionary terms, selection pressure had shifted faster than optimization cycles. The fitness function changed mid-game. Fitness W is not prestige. It is survival times reproduction over time. And survival depends on context. When wildfire seasons lengthened and agricultural zones destabilized, traits previously deemed suboptimal gained value. Metabolic thrift, heat tolerance, immune overreactivity in certain pathogen landscapes. Suddenly, genomic portfolios that looked mediocre in peacetime markets outperformed under stress. The phrase reparations by reproduction emerged not from governments but from demographers. It described a demographic correction driven by differential fertility and environmental resilience. Communities once economically suppressed were expanding proportionally, not through policy but through adaptability. Elites responded with accelerated editing cycles, faster updates, quarterly genomic recalibrations. But rapid editing introduced new complexity costs. Epistatic interactions, genes influencing other genes, began producing nonlinear side effects. Optimize Z destabilize B. It was a systems problem. Fxy is not equal to Fx plus Fy. Non-additivity. In complex genomes, traits do not stack cleanly. They interfere. OpenHelix released a comparative study showing that populations with moderate enhancement and high baseline diversity exhibited more stable long-term outcome distributions than highly optimized, low-diversity cohorts. Markets panicked quietly. Longevity bonds tied to narrow elite gene pools fluctuated. Height futures seemed trivial against immune system volatility. For the first time, reproductive strategy became geopolitical. States began funding public genomic diversity initiatives under the banner of resilience security. Not eugenics. Anti-fragility. Encourage interlineage mixing. Subsidize reproductive plurality. The progenitor resistance, once dismissed as analog romantics, found unlikely allies among quantitative ecologists and systems theorists. The argument shifted from morality to math. Homogeneity maximizes short-term predictability. Diversity maximizes long-term survival. The child who couldn't be owned became emblematic again. Her variance was not an anomaly. It was a preview. Reparations by reproduction was not revenge. It was rebalancing. When capital skews opportunity, biology sometimes compensates through differential adaptability. No central planner orchestrated it. No manifesto mandated it. Selection pressure does not negotiate. Selects. In elite enclaves, a new anxiety took root. What if optimization made us fragile? Cryovault diversification programs quietly expanded acquisition strategies, seeking broader allele pools from previously overlooked regions. Suddenly, the global south was not a labor market. It was a genomic asset class. Critics called it Extraction 2.0. Genome Commons countered with open treaties. Genomic exchange must be reciprocal, transparent, and community-governed. No more one-way harvesting of resilience traits. The market tried to quantify the shift. Demographers plotted population trajectories. Population next period equals current population plus births, B, minus deaths, D, plus migration, M. But beneath that simple equation lurked complexity. Births were now influenced by cultural coordination, deaths by environmental instability, migration by climate and policy collapse. Gene pools were not passive reservoirs. They were active agents. Reparations by reproduction did not topple elites overnight. It altered the slope. It reminded the world that evolution does not reward dominance alone. It rewards adaptability. And adaptability favors variation. Markets had tried to narrow humanity into efficient bands of excellence. The aftershock revealed a counterforce. Life widens. When constrained too tightly, it spills elsewhere. In the end, the rebellion was quiet. No riots. No coups. Just births. Different births. Across regions markets once ignored. The balance of advantage began to tilt. Not because someone decreed justice, but because probability under pressure redistributes power. Through the most ancient mechanism of all, who survives and who multiplies. 17. The collapse of genetic exclusivity. Scarcity moves again. Exclusivity was supposed to last longer. That was the pitch. Optimize early. Secure advantage. Compound superiority across generations. The first decade of enhancement capitalism behaved exactly as forecast. Trait clustering among elites increased. Performance metrics rose. Longevity curves separated. Scarcity appeared biological. But scarcity is restless. It migrates. At first, the collapse was subtle. Open-source wet labs began replicating first-generation enhancement edits using public CRISPR stacks and community-funded compute clusters. What had cost millions now cost thousands. The supply curve shifted. As price P fell, quantity supplied Q expanded. Genetic upgrades stopped being a luxury artifact and started behaving like consumer tech. The elite response was predictable. Move up the stack. If baseline edits become common, escalate to multi-locus optimization bundles. If those diffuse, escalate to epigenetic tuning, then to dynamic gene expression management. But each escalation followed the same economic gravity. Diffusion. Knowledge leaks. Toolchains commoditize. Black markets mature. The exclusivity window shrank from decades to years. And then something more destabilizing occurred. Cross-population recombination began outperforming isolated elite lines. Not because enhancements failed. Because once enhancements became widespread, differentiation no longer resided in individual loci. It resided in interaction effects. In combinatorial diversity, the math was brutal. The number of possible combinations explodes as N grows. When optimized traits spread across broader populations, the space of possible pairings expanded exponentially. Innovation migrated from proprietary edits to emergent recombination. The vault families had optimized vertically. The open world optimized horizontally. And horizontal scales faster. Financial markets sensed it before the boardrooms did. Premiums attached to exclusive genome lines began flattening. Secondary markets for cryo-assets cooled. Investors realized something uncomfortable. If everyone can access version 3.0 enhancements, exclusivity shifts to version 4.0, but version 4.0 will also diffuse. Scarcity was no longer genetic. It became temporal. Early access, not permanent advantage. Value V decays over time T, as diffusion rate K increases. The half-life of biological advantage shortened. The collapse of genetic exclusivity did not mean equality. It meant acceleration. Advantages flickered instead of ossifying. Meanwhile, regulatory arbitrage widened access in unexpected regions. Several mid-tier nations, seeking talent influx, subsidized public enhancement clinics under open licenses. Their pitch was simple. If genetic upgrades are inevitable, democratize them. Talent migration followed. The elite enclaves discovered that biological advantage without social dynamism underperformed. Because performance is contextual. You can enhance cognition. You cannot patent opportunity density. Even more destabilizing was the rise of adaptive epigenetics, lifestyle-linked expression modulation that required no permanent edit. Nutrition stacks. Environmental conditioning. AI-personalized developmental scaffolds. Enhancement became behavioral, which meant it could not be inherited exclusively. It had to be maintained. Scarcity moved from DNA to discipline, from sequence to ecosystem. The market recalibrated again. The most valuable asset was no longer a rare allele. It was access to adaptive feedback loops, continuous optimization environments. In other words, infrastructure. Elites who once guarded vaults began investing in platforms, learning substrates, climate-controlled habitats, neuroadaptive education grids. Because once genes commoditize, environment differentiates. The final symbolic blow came when a public consortium published a comparative performance study. Third-generation open-source mixed-lineage cohorts outperformed legacy exclusive lines in problem-solving under novel stress scenarios. Not by maximizing any single metric, by recombining many. The narrative flipped. Exclusivity began to look like isolation. Isolation looked like fragility. The old equation of power. Rare genes equals lasting dominance. Fractured. Scarcity did not disappear. It migrated. From genes to time. From sequences to systems. From inheritance to iteration speed. In the aftermath, even vault families diversified outward. Cross-lineage marriages once considered reputational dilution became strategic alliances. Gene pools reopened. Because closed systems stagnate. The collapse of genetic exclusivity was not a moral triumph. It was thermodynamic. Information spreads. Tools replicate. Barriers erode. Any advantage rooted in secrecy decays in an open computational civilization. Scarcity always moves to the frontier. And the frontier this time was not DNA. It was adaptability. When exclusivity collapsed, humanity did not equalize. It liquefied. Power stopped being encoded in static genomes and started flowing through dynamic networks. The vaults remained. But they were no longer fortresses. They were archives. And in a world where the code of life is editable, shareable, and remixable, no lineage stays rare for long. Scarcity moves. It always does. The question is not whether advantage exists. It is how fast it melts. 18. Prodigy dissolves. Or evolves. Corporations don't die the way organisms do. They rebrand. They restructure. They absorb blame and spin off liability. But sometimes they molt. By the time genetic exclusivity collapsed, Prodigy was no longer a villain. It was infrastructure. Its optimization engines powered public clinics. Its forecasting APIs underwrote sovereign health bonds. Its cryostorage standards became global baselines. You cannot boycott a substrate. Yet something was eroding. The old revenue model depended on asymmetry. Proprietary weighting schemas. Private enhancement tiers. Exclusive access to predictive trait markets. When open-source biology matured and enhancement diffused, Prodigy's core advantage, secrecy, decayed exponentially. Value tied to opacity shrinks as diffusion K accelerates. Their quarterly reports stopped emphasizing exclusivity and began emphasizing adaptive governance. A new division launched, Prodigy Commons. Open auditing, transparent weighting coefficients, community oversight nodes. Critics called it survival theater. Supporters called it maturity. The internal documents told a more interesting story. Prodigy's own simulations had converged on an uncomfortable conclusion. Long-term stability required distributed genetic diversity. Monopoly over optimization was mathematically suboptimal. Maximize EW subject to var W, epsilon. Maximize expected fitness, EW. Under variance constraints. Centralized control increased systemic variance under environmental shock. Distributed enhancement reduced it. In short, the system was safer if PRODIGY relinquished control. This is where the narrative fractures. Did PRODIGY dissolve under public pressure? Or did it evolve because its own models demanded it? The IPO that once could not be shorted became irrelevant. Shareholders voted to convert core patents into perpetual public trusts in exchange for sovereign-backed infrastructure contracts. A pivot from product to protocol, from gatekeeper to guarantor. The move stunned markets. Stock volatility spiked. Short-term variance exploded. Long-term projections stabilized. PRODIGY stopped selling genetic advantage. It began selling resilience frameworks, global enhancement guidelines, ethical compliance layers, adaptive climate genome integration stacks. In effect, it admitted something radical. Optimization cannot be proprietary in a thermodynamic system. Information flows. Traits diffuse. Scarcity migrates. If you fight entropy, you lose. If you harness it, you become substrate. The black ledger was deprecated, replaced by an open, encrypted lineage commons governed by rotating public councils and algorithmic oversight. No single entity could unilaterally alter similarity baselines anymore. Proof of intent laws were amended to include revocation rights and generational consent clauses. Children could opt out of inherited optimization contracts at adulthood. The most symbolic act came quietly. PRODIGY decommissioned its premium tier cryovault, the one reserved for ultra-liquid elites, and merged it with public biobanks under transparency protocols. The nitrogen aristocracy dissolved into data, or evolved into trustees. Skeptics argue this was strategic retreat. Better to guide the transition than be dismantled. Perhaps. But evolution rarely asks about motive. It selects outcomes. PRODIGY survived because it adapted its utility function. From maximizing shareholder return to minimizing systemic collapse probability. Survival is proportional to adaptability. Not a formal equation. A law of complex systems. The collapse of genetic exclusivity forced every actor to confront the same truth. Advantage that cannot circulate destabilizes the system that sustains it. In its final annual letter before restructuring, PRODIGY's board wrote, "We were never in the business of owning humanity. We were in the business of predicting it. Prediction is no longer scarce." That sentence ended an era. Enhancement did not stop. Vaults did not vanish. Markets did not evaporate. But the premise shifted. From domination to coordination. From private optimization to public calibration. PRODIGY did not dissolve into nothing. It dissolved into everything. Into standards. Into open protocols. Into background infrastructure so normalized it ceased to feel corporate. Which is perhaps the most unsettling outcome. Because when power becomes ambient, it becomes invisible. Or perhaps that is evolution. In the after, the question is no longer who owns the genome. It is who stewards the feedback loops. And whether humanity, having glimpsed its own utility functions, chooses to write them collectively, instead of outsourcing them to a vault. PRODIGY dissolved. Or evolved. The difference depends on who is holding the pen. 19. Post-human, post-profit. What remains when lineage is liquid? When lineage stopped behaving like property, something subtle dissolved with it. Inheritance had once anchored identity, blood tied to land, genes tied to capital, capital tied to power. But once genomes became editable, shareable, remixable, once exclusivity collapsed and PRODIGY faded into protocol, lineage liquefied. It no longer accumulated. It circulated. The old compounding model fractured. A tongue sticking out, 1 plus R. That equation built dynasties. Biological capital accruing return, R. Over time, T. But when edits diffuse, when access expands, when recombination outpaces ownership, our approach is zero. Advantage no longer compounds indefinitely. It decays into commons. The post-human era did not arrive with chrome limbs or uploaded minds. It arrived when the genome ceased to function as a vault. Human variation became fluid, exchanged through open registries, voluntary mixing networks, adaptive clinics. Lineage became a library. You could trace ancestry. You could borrow traits. But you could not corner the market on inheritance. Profit models faltered. Because profit depends on asymmetry, scarcity, control, temporal advantage. But genetic asymmetry shortened to months, then weeks. Optimization updates resembled software patches. And software does not generate aristocracy. It generates version churn. Markets search for new moats. Behavioral augmentation, neural interface exclusivity, longevity as a service. But each frontier faced the same gravitational pull. Information spreads. What remains when profit can no longer lock itself to blood? The answer emerged not in markets but in coordination networks. Value migrated from ownership to orchestration. The equation shifted quietly. Value equals F network trust adaptation. Not a closed-form solution. A systems relation. Network density. Trust coefficients. Adaptive speed. Post-profit did not mean no exchange. It meant exchange detached from permanent hierarchy. When lineage is liquid, identity becomes iterative. Children no longer inherit fixed destinies. They inherit toolkits. Genetic profiles update through consensual revision at adulthood. Reproductive contracts expire by design. The idea of bloodline purity becomes mathematically absurd in a combinatorial civilization. Total combinations tilde operator 2. As editable loci expand, possible configurations explode. Purity becomes impossible. Diversity becomes default. Without durable biological scarcity, the meaning of status shifts. From what you are born with to how you contribute. From inherited optimization to collaborative resilience. Post-human does not mean abandoning biology. It means recognizing biology as a platform layer. Modifiable, participatory, communal. Post-profit does not mean abolishing markets. It means markets no longer determine existential worth. When survival and adaptation are distributed, the profit motive loses its leverage over reproduction. Children are not ROI instruments. They are emergent agents. In this landscape, a new metric quietly replaced net worth. Adaptive contribution index. Not how much advantage you hoard. How much variance you enable. The old guard resisted. They always do. But even they adapted. Trust networks outperformed hoarded capital during cascading climate shocks and data blackouts. Communities with open genetic registries and reciprocal enhancement treaties stabilize faster than enclaves optimized for isolation. Because resilience scales with cooperation. System stability is proportional to diversity times connectivity system. Again, not a corporate KPI. A property of complex systems. When lineage is liquid, identity stops anchoring to ancestors. It anchors to participation. The post-human label turned out to be misleading. Nothing alien emerged. No god-tier intellects ruling from orbit. What emerged was humility. Recognition that optimization without circulation breeds fragility. Recognition that profit without distribution breeds collapse. The genome, once securitized, returned to what it had always been. Probabilistic script. Editable. Mutable. Unownable in perpetuity. In the end, what remains is not aristocracy or annihilation. It is negotiation. Between freedom and coordination. Between variance and coherence. Between the desire to optimize and the need to remain open. When lineage becomes liquid, humanity stops asking who inherits. Starts asking how we iterate. Post-human. Post-profit. Not the end of ambition. The end of permanent advantage. And in that dissolution, something older resurfaces. Life not as asset, but as process. Unfinished. Unowned. Still writing itself. 20. Appendix. How to start your own gene bank. For educational purposes only. Let's be clear. You don't start a gene bank the way you start a startup. You don't order liquid nitrogen in a chest freezer and call it sovereignty. You don't crowdsource embryos like open source firmware. Biology is not a weekend hack. This appendix is not a lab manual. It is a systems manual. Because in the after, a gene bank is no longer a vault of frozen advantage. It is a coordination protocol for preserving diversity. If you misunderstand that, you rebuild the old aristocracy with cheaper tools. 1. Define the purpose, not the product. A vault hoards. A bank preserves. A commons circulates. The first decision is philosophical. Are you attempting to concentrate traits or to distribute resilience? If your objective function resembles this, maximize T, where T is a narrow trait cluster, height, IQ proxy, longevity percentile. You are rebuilding exclusivity. If instead your aim resembles, maximize diversity subject to safety, you are building infrastructure for adaptability. The difference determines everything downstream. 2. Governance before genetics. Do not start with freezers. Start with bylaws. Who controls access? Who audits decisions? Who holds revocation power? Genetic storage without governance becomes futile. Your architecture should assume no single node retains unilateral control. Decision authority rotates. Transparency is default. Future generations have opt-out rights. If lineage becomes liquid, governance must be fluid too. 3. Diversity is a mathematical asset. Biological systems survive shocks when variability remains high. H equals 1 minus sigma pi superscript 2. Expected heterozygosity, H, increases as allele distribution widens. Translation. Do not curate for aesthetic preference. Do not filter for prestige markers. Prioritize breadth across immune markers, metabolic traits, cognitive styles, environmental tolerances. Diversity is not charity. It is shock absorption. 4. Avoid static optimization. A gene bank that locks traits into a permanent ideal becomes obsolete. The environment changes. Selection pressures move. Design your system to incorporate feedback loops. Adaptation is proportional to variation times feedback. Without variation, feedback cannot refine. Without feedback, variation drifts. Your bank should function less like a museum and more like a living registry. 5. Consent across time. The original vault era made a catastrophic assumption. Parental intent equals permanent consent. In the after, that premise collapses. Any ethical gene bank must include explicit donor consent, clear usage constraints, sunset clauses, adult opt-out rights. No genome is property in perpetuity. Treat stored material as entrusted, not owned. 6. Infrastructure over secrecy. Scarcity once lived in cryogenic exclusivity. Now it lives in infrastructure quality. Reliable power. Redundant storage. Disaster resilience. Data integrity. If your system cannot survive grid failure or jurisdictional collapse, it is decorative. Security should protect privacy, not hoard advantage. Opaque systems decay faster in an open civilization. 7. Financial model, post-profit, not anti-funding. You will need resources. But funding tied to trait prioritization corrupts intent. If investors demand preferred access, you are not building a bank. You are building a portfolio. Sustainable models may include cooperative membership, public trust endowments, transparent service fees, sovereign resilience grants. Return on investment should be measured in system stability, not lineage leverage. 8. Interoperability. No gene bank should function as an island. Closed pools stagnate. Open exchange treaties, ethically governed and transparently audited, increase long-term resilience. System stability is proportional to diversity times connectivity. Connectivity multiplies the value of diversity. Isolation reduces it. 9. Cultural layer matters. Genes do not operate in vacuum. Education systems, nutritional environments, community networks. A gene bank without ecological scaffolding misunderstands biology. Epigenetics reminds us. Expression depends on context. Storing genomes without investing in environments is like archiving seeds without soil. 10. Know the risk. Let's speak plainly. Genetic storage intersects with law, medicine, ethics, and global treaties. Unauthorized experimentation, improper handling, or bypassing regulation can cause harm, legally and biologically. This appendix is not instruction for clinical practice. It is a conceptual map. Real-world implementation requires licensed professionals, regulatory compliance, and rigorous biosecurity standards. Romanticizing DIY genetics is reckless. What a gene bank becomes. In the post-exclusivity era, a gene bank is not about control. It is about memory, not about advantage, about continuity. When lineage is liquid, preservation shifts from hoarding to stewardship, from private vault to public trust. The real question is not, how do I store superior genes? It is, how do we preserve option space for futures we cannot predict? Because the future will not respect your favorite trait cluster. It will reward adaptability. If you start your own gene bank, educationally, philosophically, structurally, start it with humility. Start it with rotation of power. Start it knowing that any advantage you attempt to freeze will thaw. And when it does, the only durable asset will be the governance you built around it. In the after, biology is no longer a ladder. It is a library. Build yours accordingly. 21. A corporate prospectus page from PRODIGY. S1 filing. PRODIGY LLC. Amendment number 0 to Form S1. Filed pursuant to Section 12B of the Post-Scarcity Exchange Act. The Gene Bank ticker symbol, Proposed DNAQ Exchange, NASGX, Narrative Asset Growth Exchange. Prospectus Summary. PRODIGY LLC, PRODIGY, we, us, or the company, is a vertically integrated genomic asset platform operating at the intersection of abundance collapse and biological scarcity. In an era where information, manufacturing, and cognition have reached near zero marginal cost, PRODIGY identifies the final durable moat: inheritable biological variants. We do not sell products. We securitize potential. Our mission: to unlock shareholder value from the last non-replicable asset class, human genomic differentiation. Corporate motto: in post-scarcity, scarcity becomes you. Market opportunity: global GDP commoditized. Intellectual property: open-sourced. Labor automated. Compute abundant. Remaining defensible scarcity. Scarcity equals F, non-minus replicability, where non-replicability approaches zero for digital goods and trends toward asymptotic durability for inheritable biological traits. Total addressable market, TAM. All future humans. Our platform. PRODIGY operates a three-layer architecture. 1. Acquisition layer. Ethically sourced, consent-forward genomic deposits from high-variance donors. 2. Curation layer. Trait clustering, probabilistic projection, and heritable differentiation modeling. 3. Allocation layer. Premium tier access pathways for clients seeking optimized lineage positioning. Projected return model. ROI is proportional to trait demand times exclusivity. As abundance increases elsewhere, exclusivity multipliers intensify. Competitive advantage. First mover advantage in post-material asset classes. Proprietary Genome Differentiation Index, GDI. Cross-border cryogenic jurisdiction arbitrage. Adaptive trait forecasting engine. Unlike traditional biobanks, PRODIGY does not merely preserve. We price the future. Risk factors. Investing in PRODIGY involves significant risks, including but not limited to regulatory reclassification of inheritable material as commons infrastructure, ethical backlash against genomic commodification, emergence of open-source gene pools reducing exclusivity premium, cultural shift toward post-ownership lineage models, the possibility that diversity, not optimization, becomes the dominant survival variable. If the following becomes civilizational consensus, resilience is proportional to diversity times access. PRODIGY's premium differentiation strategy may face compression. Use of proceeds. We intend to use net proceeds from this offering to expand cryogenic storage facilities in geopolitically stable microstates, scale predictive embryonic trait analytics, lobby for favorable genomic asset classification, develop subscription-based inheritance enhancement tiers. No portion of proceeds will be used for humility. Ethical position statement. PRODIGY affirms that all donor material is obtained through informed consent protocols compliant with applicable regulations. We believe monetization and morality are not mutually exclusive categories, though we reserve the right to test this thesis iteratively. Dilution. Post-offering, founders will retain supervoting shares controlling 87% of all lineage allocation decisions. Public shareholders will receive exposure to the genomic asset class without direct reproductive governance rights. Forward-looking statements. This prospectus contains forward-looking statements including, but not limited to, the continued migration of scarcity from material goods to biological differentiation, the persistence of status competition under abundance conditions, the willingness of affluent clients to convert liquidity into heritable advantage. Actual results may differ materially if genetic exclusivity collapses, cooperative gene commons emerge, cultural norms shift from ownership to stewardship. Final note to investors: when everything else can be copied, streamed, fabricated, or synthesized, what remains defensible? PRODIGY LLC believes the answer is simple. You invest accordingly. 22. A cinematic one before last chapter. Cold open in a nitrogen vault. Cold open nitrogen. The door unlocks with a sound like a held breath finally released. Inside, the vault exhales winter. White vapor spills low across the floor, hugging polished concrete like a cautious animal. The air tastes metallic. Every surface glows faint blue under recessed strips of surgical light. Stainless steel cylinders rise in rows, silent, upright sarcophagi labeled not with names, but with alphanumeric futures. A thin frost clings to the biometric scanner. Temperature display: minus 196 degrees Celsius. Liquid nitrogen does not burn. It erases motion. Suspends consequence. A technician or maybe a thief steps in. Hard to tell in this light. Face half hidden behind a respirator. Eyes reflecting the rows of preserved inheritance. Each tank holds potential. Each tank holds a wager. The vault is not loud, but it hums. Circulation pumps whisper like distant surf. Pressure valves tick with slow mechanical patience. Somewhere, a droplet of condensed air falls and shatters into nothing. On the far wall, a polished plaque. PRODIGY LLC, archive be continuity through exclusivity. The figure pauses at tank 47C. GDI rating: 9.81 projected longevity percentile, 99.3 cognitive variance index. Elite band. The screen beneath the label scrolls predictive models of a person who does not yet exist. Probability curves bloom across the glass. P trait equals F, genotype, environment. The environment variable flickers. Uncertain. Unpriced. The figure places a gloved hand on the cylinder. Inside, suspended in pale vapor, microscopic strands coil in silence. DNA like frost-written scripture. Once these were cells. Now they are derivatives. The vault lights dim for night cycle. Emergency strips remain. Blue becomes darker blue. A security camera rotates. The technician thief produces a small device. Matte black, unbranded. It connects to the tank's access port with a soft click. No alarms. Just data transfer. In the distance, a compressor kicks on deeper than before. The device screen displays something unexpected. Commons protocol detected. A second interface overlays the proprietary dashboard. Lines of code ripple across the glass like thawing ice. Access tiers begin to dissolve. Exclusivity rating recalculates. 9.817.24.61.0. Scarcity evaporates faster than nitrogen. The vault does not understand this. It was built to preserve differentiation. It was not built to survive democratization. The figure hesitates. One command remains. Execute distribution? Outside, somewhere above this underground cathedral of inheritance, a storm gathers over the city. Power flickers once, not enough to fail, but enough to remind the system it is mortal. The gloved finger hovers. Inside the tank, genomes wait without preference. They do not know whether they are luxury goods or library books. They do not care. The screen counts down. 3-2. Cut to black. The hiss of nitrogen continues in the dark. 23. Netflix synopsis with an A-list cast of central characters: CEO, rogue embryologist, gene pirate, anomaly child. Prodigy LLC. Netflix limited series, 8 episodes. Genre: techno-thriller/prestige sci-fi/corporate noir. Tagline: when everything becomes abundant, the last scarcity is you. Series synopsis: in the near future, AI has automated labor, dissolved intellectual property, and driven the cost of nearly everything to zero. Markets didn't disappear. They pivoted. Enter Prodigy LLC, the world's most valuable private company. A discrete genomic asset firm that securitizes elite DNA and sells probabilistic futures to the ultra-wealthy. But when an anomalous embryo emerges from inside Prodigy's vault, a genome that resists optimization and crashes their predictive engine, the illusion of control begins to fracture. What follows is a high-stakes battle over ownership of the human future: corporate governance versus genetic commons, inheritance versus unpredictability, profit versus personhood. This is not about cloning. It's about capitalization of potential. A list cast of central characters. The CEO Adrian Vale. Played by Michael Fassbender. Founder and architect of Prodigy LLC. Cold, visionary, immaculately rational. Vale believes he solved capitalism's final problem: how to generate return in a post-scarcity world. His thesis is simple: if goods are free, differentiation is everything. He doesn't see himself as a villain. He sees himself as infrastructure. Until the anomaly proves his models wrong. And the markets do not forgive wrong. The rogue embryologist, Dr. Mira Kwan, played by Gemma Chan, led genomic architect inside Prodigy's vaults. Brilliant, controlled, quietly radical. She built the company's trait prediction engine and knows its limits. When embryo number 7349 refuses optimization and exhibits emergent traits outside all statistical bands, Mira realizes something terrifying. The child may represent evolutionary resilience, the very thing Prodigy's premium clients are suppressing. She must decide whether to protect the company or the future. The gene pirate Luca Loxerano, played by Oscar Isaac, former biotech security engineer turned genomic hacktivist. He doesn't steal money. He liberates inheritance. Operating through offshore free zones and floating clinics, Locke exposes Prodigy's proprietary genome differentiation index and leaks elite lineage data to open-source networks. To him, DNA is not an asset class. It's a commons. But when he encounters the anomaly child, even he questions whether total openness can protect what makes humanity adaptive. The anomaly child Lyra, age 10 by episode 8, played by Brooklyn Prince. Born from a supposedly optimized lineage portfolio, but statistically inefficient. Lyra's genome shows unpredictable expression patterns. She performs poorly on standardized enhancement metrics, yet displays extraordinary integrative cognition no algorithm forecasted. She is not superior. She is unexpected. And in a system built on probabilistic certainty, unexpected is destabilizing. As Prodigy's valuation surges and collapses in real time, Lyra becomes both target and symbol, the living argument against genetic exclusivity. Tone and style. Think. Corporate glass towers like cathedrals. Nitrogen vaults lit like sacred crypts. Boardroom battles intercut with biometric scans. Market tickers colliding with ultrasound heartbeats. Less dystopia. More plausible inevitability. Core conflict. If the value of a genome can be modeled, indexed, and traded, who owns the child? The shareholders? The parents? The algorithm? Or the child herself? Final episode tease. As Prodigy prepares for its quiet IPO, unshortable, unstoppable, the anomaly dataset goes public. Scarcity shifts. Exclusivity cracks. And the last line of dialogue, whispered over a collapsing stock chart. Evolution doesn't optimize for profit. Fade to black. Pirate first. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and to support my work with BTC. Send it to 1MXMPFCJVMXSBQRLUC 5BAKNFU6 or with fiat at PayPal, me/Martin Chartrand. Subscribe. Substack note. Prodigy LLC, the Gene Bank. In a world where information is infinite and replication is trivial, What becomes scarce? Not data, not content, not compute. You. The poster for this week's issue is satire, but only slightly. When abundance eats every other moat, capital looks for the last enclosure. The body becomes a balance sheet. The genome becomes collateral. The sales pitch writes itself. In post-scarcity, scarcity becomes you. This piece dissects the psychological pivot from ownership of things to ownership of traits. When everything is free, what's left to monetize? And who gets to decide? The future won't be decided by better products. It will be decided by better governance of what cannot ethically be owned. Read before someone offers you a premium tier for your DNA. Pirate first. Short X post. When everything becomes abundant, capital hunts the last scarce thing. PRODIGY LLC isn't sci-fi. It's a warning label. In post-scarcity, scarcity becomes you. Hashtag gene economy, hashtag post-scarcity, hashtag biocapital, hashtag cognitive commons, hashtag pirate first, hashtag MXTM, hashtag future of ownership, hashtag lineage markets. Hashtag gene economy, hashtag post-scarcity, hashtag biocapital, hashtag genome markets, hashtag DAN is the new oil, hashtag lineage liquidity, hashtag genetic exclusivity, hashtag trait arbitrage, hashtag biofinance, hashtag future of ownership, hashtag cognitive commons, hashtag pirate first, hashtag MXTM, hashtag speculative futures, hashtag technocapital, hashtag bioethics, hashtag genomic governance, hashtag open source humanity, hashtag digital feudalism, hashtag abundance paradox, hashtag scarcity shift, hashtag synthetic biology, hashtag CRISPR capital, hashtag human infrastructure, hashtag decentralized futures, hashtag sovereign biology, hashtag data to DNA, hashtag embryo economics, hashtag longevity markets, hashtag inheritance 2_0, hashtag post-human capital, hashtag liquid lineage, hashtag adaptive civilization, hashtag resilience economy, hashtag commons not cages, hashtag futures thinking, hashtag philosophy of tech, hashtag biopower, hashtag algorithmic society, hashtag infrastructure politics, hashtag the after revelation of the MXTM method. https://chatgpt.com/share/69a4617-3bf4-8000108173023. https://gemini google.com/share/01466f144034. Spermjackers of the elite. MXTMAK Pirate 1 VJ June 19, 2025. June 19, 2029 Secret Nodes decoded by MXTM. Read full story. Procreative Variations. A Guide to Futureling's Baby. MXTMAK Pirate 1 VJ July 20, 2025. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work. Read full story. Related reading.
This one's sanitized. Next. Got it. Holding for review. Good. Keep the pace up.
The Pirate First's log, YouTube's comment section is a managed illusion. YouTube's burning library and the war on your mind. February 18, 2026. Let me tell you what happened to me this morning. I was in a YouTube comment section trying to do something radical, have a conversation, cross-referencing a video with outside sources, linking to forums where the real, unfiltered technical debate lived, pointing people toward the deeper archive, the longer thread, the inconvenient counterargument. Gone. Ghosted. Held for review. Vanished into the digital ether. And that right there, mates, is not an accident. That is policy. The polite face of censorship. YouTube doesn't call it censorship, of course. That would be too honest for a company that runs on advertiser goodwill and quarterly earnings calls. They call it their external links policy, and on paper, it sounds perfectly reasonable. Links to malware, phishing sites, pornography, apps that install unwanted software, all prohibited. Google support, nobody's arguing with that. But the algorithm doesn't read context. It reads pattern. And the pattern it has learned to suppress is this: any comment that points you somewhere else. Reddit. Flagged. GitHub. Suspicious. A decade-old technical forum where real practitioners have been arguing the details for years. That's a potential vector for inauthentic engagement, mate. Gone before you can blink. The policy says it targets content that violates community guidelines. In some cases, they may make exceptions for content with educational, documentary, scientific, or artistic context. Google support may. In some cases, that's not a right. That's a favor. And favors, as any pirate knows, are given to those who cooperate with the fleet. The algorithm as Censor-in-Chief, T6. Thanks for reading MXDM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Send it to 1npchxmpfzjvmxsbpqvrwaluc5baknfu6 or with fiat at paypal.me. Martin Chartrand. February 12th. MXTM. Substack.
Dispatch from the cognitive insurgency. The revolution wasn't fought, it was deployed. The crisis failed. Blockades collapsed, control is obsolete. The Straight Gambit, a chronicle of the last control protocol.
Pirate First Dispatch from the Cognitive Insurgency, MXTM, February 15, 2026. By Pirate First Dispatch from the Cognitive Insurgency, MXTM's newsletter, February 2026. They didn't lose control overnight. They lost it in 10,000 basement laboratories, in mesh networks spanning favelas and suburbs, in local language models that couldn't be censored, in agent swarms that automated dignity. By October 2025, the powers that were faced an existential threat they'd never encountered. The plebs had the tools. Provocative. They orchestrated a blockade to stop you from running local AI. It failed. Not because we fought, because we built better. The Straight Gambit, when manufactured scarcity met distributed competence. Chronicle is live. Pirate flag. Hashtag cognitive insurgency, hashtag pirate first.
It takes a pirate to catch one.
Amazon rarely provides restitution for lost royalties and what indies can do about it. The quiet arithmetic of a broken system. There's a pattern repeating across Amazon's marketplace day after day. A counterfeit book goes live. It ranks. It siphons sales. An author discovers it. They file a report. Days or weeks pass. The listing disappears. And then nothing. No retroactive payment for the revenue Amazon collected during those stolen weeks. No compensation for diverted sales.
But indies
No
get
real
forms.
consequences for the infringer. The music industry forced platform.